My greedy husband demanded that I give him my dream car and all my savings to clear his gambling debts. When I refused, he slapped me hard and yelled, "How dare you disobey my orders?" My mother-in-law also wanted me kicked out of the house. Secretly, I created a revenge plan, and the very next day, when they woke up, a horrific surprise awaited them. My name is Eleanor Carter, and there was a time when I thought my life was perfect. I had a loving husband, a beautiful home, and dreams for a future filled with happiness. But life has a way of pulling back the curtains, revealing truths you never wanted to see. I met Henry Carter during my last year at university. He was everything I thought I wanted: charming, attentive, and so full of promises. He told me I was the love of his life, the woman he had been waiting for. At 26, I believed him with my whole heart. We got married quickly, swept up in the whirlwind of romance, and I truly thought I had found my happily ever after. But things began to change the moment we moved into Henry's family home in Dallas. It wasn't my choice to live there, but Henry insisted. He said it was temporary, just until we saved up enough to buy a place of our own. What I didn't know was that his mother, Sylvia Carter, ruled that house, and Henry, like a tyrant. Sylvia was the kind of woman who always needed to be in control. She was in her mid-50s, an experienced real estate agent with a sharp tongue and an even sharper temper. From the start, she made it clear she didn't think I was good enough for her son. She criticized everything: my clothes, my cooking, even the way I spoke. "Henry deserves better," she'd say with a thin smile, as if I weren't even in the room. At first, I tried to be polite. I told myself it was just her way, that she'd warm up to me eventually. But she never did. Instead, her insults grew harsher, and her manipulation more obvious. She'd corner Henry whenever I wasn't around, filling his head with doubts about me. "Eleanor's too young to understand responsibility," she'd say. "She's holding you back." What hurt the most was how Henry reacted. He never stood up for me. Not once. Whenever Sylvia said something cruel, he'd look away, pretending not to hear. And when I confronted him about it, he'd shrug and say, "That's just how Mom is. Don't take it personally." But it was personal. Every word she said, every glare she threw my way, cut me deeper than I cared to admit. Still, I held on. I told myself things would get better. I loved Henry, and I believed that love would be enough to get us through. I was wrong. The breaking point came about 2 years into our marriage. Henry had always been a bit careless with money, but I didn't realize just how bad things had gotten. One night, he came home looking pale and nervous. I knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," he said, avoiding my eyes. He told me he had made some bad decisions, gambling, borrowing money from people he shouldn't have, and now he was in serious trouble. He owed tens of thousands of dollars, and the creditors were demanding payment. "I need your help, Eleanor," he said. "I'm asking you to sell your car and give me your savings. It's the only way we can fix this." I stared at him in disbelief. My car wasn't just a car, it was my dream, something I had worked so hard for. And my savings? That was supposed to be for our future, for the home we wanted to buy. How could he even ask me to give it all up to clean up his mess? "No," I said firmly. "I won't do it. I've already sacrificed so much, Henry. You need to take responsibility for your own actions." His face darkened. I'd never seen him like that before. "Don't you dare talk to me like that," he snapped. "I'm your husband. You're supposed to support me." "Support you?" I shot back. "All I've done is support you. But this is too much. You've let your mother walk all over me, and now you want me to fix your mistakes?" "No, Henry, I won't." And then it happened. He slapped me hard. The force of it knocked me back a step, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The shock, the pain, it was overwhelming. He didn't even apologize. He just stood there, his face a mix of anger and shame. I locked myself in the bathroom that night, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was red and swollen, but that wasn't what hurt the most. It was the betrayal, the realization that the man I thought I loved had become a stranger. A coward. Something inside me broke that night, but in its place, something new began to grow. A fire, a determination I didn't know I had. I wasn't going to let Henry or his mother destroy me. I was done being their victim. I made a decision right then and there. I would take back control of my life. And I would make them pay for everything they had done to me. After that night, something shifted in me. I was no longer the same Eleanor Carter who had tiptoed around Sylvia's insults or begged Henry for respect. I realized I couldn't count on anyone else to stand up for me. If I wanted my life back, I had to fight for it myself. And fight I would. In the days that followed, I acted like everything was normal. Henry's slap had shaken me to my core, but I didn't let him see that. He thought I'd forgiven him, or maybe he didn't care. Either way, I knew that if I wanted to get out of this mess, I had to play my cards carefully. The last thing I needed was for him or Sylvia to suspect what I was planning. I started small, gathering evidence piece by piece. Sylvia had always been boastful about her success in real estate. She loved to brag about her deals and connections, especially during her lavish dinner parties. What she didn't realize was how much she revealed when she was trying to impress her guests. One evening, while serving dessert, I overheard her talking about a creative accounting trick she used to avoid paying taxes on her commissions. "The IRS won't notice if you know how to shuffle things around," she said with a smirk, her wine glass in hand. I pretended not to hear, but my mind was racing. If Sylvia was involved in tax fraud, there had to be evidence somewhere. I started paying close attention to her office. Sylvia had a habit of leaving her paperwork scattered across her desk, and I made mental notes whenever I could. One day, while she was out at a showing, I managed to sneak into her office and take pictures of some of the documents. They didn't make much sense to me at the time, numbers and codes scribbled in margins, but I figured they'd be useful later. Meanwhile, I started documenting Henry's behavior. I knew it wasn't enough to expose Sylvia. I needed to show the world who Henry really was. Whenever he yelled or made threats, I recorded him on my phone. I took pictures of the bruises he left and saved copies of text messages where he blamed me for his problems. It was painful to relive those moments, but I knew they would be my armor when the time came to fight. I couldn't do this alone, though. That's when I reached out to Detective Marcus Hill. I had met him a few years ago through a friend, and I remembered him as someone who genuinely cared about justice. It was terrifying to tell him everything, the abuse, the fraud, the betrayal, but he listened patiently, taking notes as I poured my heart out. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But you need to be careful. People like Sylvia don't go down without a fight."
"I know," I said.
"But I'm not scared of her anymore." With Marcus's guidance, I started building my case. He explained how we could use the evidence I'd gathered to trigger an investigation into Sylvia's business. He also encouraged me to file for divorce and press charges against Henry for domestic violence. It felt overwhelming at first, like I was standing at the base of a mountain I didn't know how to climb. But Marcus reminded me that I wasn't alone. "Step by step, Eleanor," he said. "We'll take them down together." The first step was leaking Sylvia's tax fraud to the authorities. I sent the photos of her documents to the IRS anonymously, along with a detailed letter explaining her schemes. I made sure to include just enough information to make them curious without revealing that I was the source. I didn't want Sylvia to suspect me, at least not yet. Next, I filed for divorce. That conversation with Henry was one of the hardest moments of my life. He looked at me with a mix of anger and disbelief as I handed him the papers. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice rising. "You're my wife. We're supposed to fix this together." "Fix this?" I said, my voice shaking. "You think I can fix this after everything you've done? You hit me, Henry. You let your mother treat me like dirt. You've lied, you've gambled, and you've ruined everything we had. I'm done." His response was cold and venomous. "You'll regret this, Eleanor. You think you're better than me? Let's see how far you get without me." I walked away from that conversation feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt free. But I wasn't done yet. Sylvia still had no idea what was coming, and I intended to keep it that way. While the IRS investigation unfolded, I worked closely with Marcus to ensure my evidence against Henry was solid. I wanted the world to see him for who he really was, a selfish, Abusive man who didn't deserve the power he thought he had over me. I didn't know how long it would take for everything to come to light, but I was willing to wait. I had spent years suffering in silence, and I was done playing the victim. This time, I was in control. And I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to win. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. I knew that taking down Sylvia and Henry wouldn't happen overnight, but every piece of evidence I gathered brought me closer to my goal. The IRS had begun their investigation into Sylvia's real estate fraud, and though I didn't know the details, I could sense the tension growing in the house. Sylvia was on edge, snapping at everyone and spending hours locked in her office. She didn't know the source of the leak, but her paranoia was palpable. I played my role perfectly, acting as though I had no idea what was going on. To her, I was still the quiet, unremarkable daughter-in-law she could ignore. She had no idea that I was the one who had set everything in motion. As for Henry, he was unraveling faster than I expected. The divorce papers had shaken him, but the realization that I wasn't backing down seemed to hit him even harder. He tried every tactic to manipulate me, pleading, blaming, even threatening, but I refused to engage. Every conversation we had was another opportunity for me to gather evidence. One evening, Henry cornered me in the kitchen. His eyes were bloodshot, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You're ruining my life, Eleanor," he slurred. "Do you even care what you're doing to this family?" I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "This family ruined itself, Henry. You and your mother made sure of that." He lunged toward me, his face twisted with anger, but I held my ground. I had learned not to fear him anymore. Instead, I calmly turned on my phone's recorder in my pocket, making sure to capture every word he said. "You think you're so clever," he sneered. "But you'll see. I'll make sure you regret this." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His threats were just empty words, and soon, he'd realized just how powerless he really was. The turning point came a week later. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a book, when Sylvia stormed in, her face red with anger. She held a stack of papers in her hand, documents from the IRS. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the papers at me. "Do you know anything about this, Eleanor?" I looked up, feigning confusion. "About what?" "This investigation," she shouted. "Someone reported my business. They're accusing me of fraud." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone calm. "Why would I know anything about that, Sylvia? I'm not involved in your business." She glared at me, her suspicion obvious, but she couldn't prove anything. Not yet, anyway. I could feel the cracks in her composure, the fear creeping in. It was only a matter of time before her empire came crashing down. Meanwhile, Marcus kept me updated on the progress of the case against Henry. With the recordings, photos, and messages I had provided, we built a strong case for domestic violence and financial abuse. When the time was right, Marcus helped me file an official complaint, ensuring that Henry would be held accountable for his actions. The fallout was swift and brutal. News of Sylvia's fraud spread quickly, tarnishing her reputation in the real estate world. Her clients began pulling out of deals, and her business started to collapse under the weight of the investigation. The IRS seized her accounts, freezing her assets while they conducted their audit. For a woman who had built her life on power and control, it was the ultimate humiliation. Henry wasn't spared either. When I pressed charges against him, it became public knowledge. People who had once admired him as a successful accountant now saw him for what he truly was, a coward who preyed on those he claimed to love. His employer fired him, and his gambling debts continued to pile up, leaving him desperate and alone. But Sylvia wasn't ready to go down without a fight. In a last-ditch effort to save herself, she tried to frame me for her crimes. She claimed that I had tampered with her records, planting evidence to make her look guilty. It was a bold move, but I was ready for it. Marcus helped me gather proof that I had no access to her accounts or records beyond what I had documented from her own negligence. When her lies fell apart under scrutiny, it only solidified her guilt. The court issued a warrant for her arrest, and Sylvia was taken into custody, her once proud demeanor replaced with fear and shame. Henry, left with nothing, came crawling back to me. He showed up at my apartment one evening, his clothes wrinkled and his face hollow. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling, "I've lost everything. Please, I need your help." I stood in the doorway, looking at the man I had once loved. He was a shadow of himself, broken and desperate. But I felt no sympathy for him. He had chosen this path, and he had no one to blame but himself. "You made your choices, Henry," I said coldly. "And now you have to live with them. I won't let you drag me down with you." As I closed the door in his face, I felt a sense of closure. For the first time in years, I was free. When I closed the door on Henry that night, it felt like closing a chapter of my life I never wanted to revisit. For years, I had lived in fear, humiliation, and heartbreak, but those chains had finally broken. The Eleanor Carter, who once tiptoed around Sylvia's wrath and Henry's indifference, no longer existed. I was free, truly free for the first time. But my story didn't end there. Justice still needed to take its course, and I wasn't about to let Sylvia or Henry escape the consequences of their actions. Sylvia's trial was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Sitting in that courtroom, I watched as the evidence I had painstakingly gathered was laid out piece by piece. The documents, the testimonies, and the transactions, it all painted a damning picture of her fraud and corruption. Sylvia, of course, tried to play the victim. "This is a misunderstanding," she pleaded, her voice trembling with feigned innocence. "I've always conducted my business with integrity." The prosecutor wasn't having it. He presented the evidence so clearly, so meticulously, that even Sylvia's high-priced lawyer couldn't refute it. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts of tax fraud and embezzlement, there was no outburst, no dramatic scene. Sylvia simply slumped in her chair, defeated. She was sentenced to several years in prison, and her empire crumbled to dust. Henry's downfall was just as inevitable. The charges of domestic violence and financial abuse, coupled with his gambling debts, left him with no defense. His reputation was in tatters, and his friends had long abandoned him. When the judge handed down the ruling, a restraining order and mandatory counseling sessions, Henry didn't even look at me. He stared at the floor, a broken man stripped of his facade. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a sense of triumph I couldn't put into words. I had stood up to the people who had tried to destroy me, and I had won. But it wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my life. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding and rediscovery. I moved into a cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a far cry from the oppressive luxury of the Carter mansion. I resumed teaching, pouring my energy into my students and finding joy in the small, everyday victories. My friend Marcus Hill, the detective who had helped me through it all, became a regular part of my life. His steady presence and encouragement reminded me that not everyone in this world is out to hurt you. One day, while tidying up my apartment, I stumbled upon an old journal I had kept before marrying Henry. Flipping through the pages, I saw a list of dreams I had written down: travel to Italy, start a garden, adopt a rescue dog. I smiled, realizing how far I had strayed from the person I once was. But now it was time to find her again. With the court proceedings behind me, I decided to treat myself to something I had long denied myself: a new car. Not just any car, but one I truly loved. It was my way of reclaiming the part of me Henry had tried to take. Driving down the open road in that shiny red convertible felt like freedom in its purest form. I also started therapy, something I had once dismissed as unnecessary. But talking to someone about the pain and trauma I had endured helped me more than I expected. My therapist, a kind and insightful woman named Dr. Lawson, helped me process my feelings and let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. But the biggest change came in the form of an unexpected opportunity. Marcus introduced me to a nonprofit organization that supported women escaping abusive relationships. They were looking for a speaker, someone who could share their story and inspire others. At first, I hesitated. The thought of standing in front of strangers and baring my soul terrified me. But Marcus reminded me of how far I had come, how much strength I had found within myself. So I agreed. My first speech was nerve-wracking, but as I stood on that stage, looking into the faces of women who had walked similar paths, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Sharing my story wasn't just about helping others, it was about healing myself. Today, I look back on those years with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the pain I endured, but gratitude for the lessons it taught me. Sylvia and Henry tried to break me, but instead, they made me stronger. They forced me to find a resilience I didn't know I had, to fight for a future I never thought I could have. I still have scars, some visible, some not, but they're a reminder of how far I've come. I'm no longer Eleanor Carter, the quiet, unassuming wife. I'm Eleanor, a survivor, an advocate, and a woman who reclaimed her life against all odds. And as I sit here, pen in hand, writing the final words of my story, I can't help but smile. Because this isn't the end, it's just the beginning.